Last time on Aaron's Eccentric Garage, I took my 1993 Mazda RX-7 out to my favorite spot to drive in Arizona to give my Tein Flex Z coilover system a baseline test before installing the EDFC Active Pros system. At the end of the drive, I gave my final thoughts about the baseline test, but it's time to go home and install the EDFC Active Pros system. Now that I'm home after doing a baseline test, it's time to install the EDFC Active Pro system on my 1993 Mazda RX-7. Welcome to Aaron's Eccentric Garage. There's a lot that goes into installing the EDFC Active Pro system into my Mazda RX-7. In addition to a very thick instruction manual, motor kit, drivers, wiring, and controller unit, there's quite a few things that you'll need to install to make sure this is done successfully. Using the tool provided in the kit, you will need to take off the selector dial on top of each of your coilovers. Using an Allen wrench, insert it into the top of the coilover and unscrew the threaded spindle inside of the coilover itself. Using the orange grease provided in the installation kit, use a generous amount inside of the top of the coilover. Apply a little of the orange grease onto the new replacement spindle and insert into the top of the coilover. Continue to tighten it down until it is flush with the top of the threaded shaft of the coilover. This may take a little bit of time, but make sure that it is flush with the top of the actual coilover itself before continuing. After the new piece is flush with the top of the coilover, use some of the orange grease that was provided and fill up the recess. Using the green thread locker that came with the kit, apply it to the threads. Once the motor has been placed onto the top of the coilover, using a flathead screwdriver, make 3 clockwise full rotations of the motor itself. After the 3 rotations have been completed, go ahead and tighten down the motor on the threads of the coilover until it is snug. Once the motor assembly is securely on the coilover, using your screwdriver again, rotate the motor assembly 2 full rotations. Afterwards, torque to specifications of the installation manual. At this point, it's time to install the silicone protective covering for the motor. Unfortunately, this is not as easy as it sounds, as the motor covering is very snug and took me quite a bit of time to install. After failing to use just my fingers to get the dust cover installed, I decided to use my handy dandy tool to get the dust cover installed properly. Now that the first motor was installed, it was time to install the remaining 3 using the same method as before. By adding the motors on top of the coilovers in the rear of the car, it did add some additional height, which prevented me from reinstalling the plastic covers over the strut tower. Sources online told me that the older EDFC motors used to be thinner, but unfortunately this is not the case for me, so it's time to make some modifications. Using a furniture grommet that I picked up from my local hardware store, I was able to install a nice clean looking modification for my application. Now that the motors were installed, it was time to add the motor drivers into the car. Using the old toolbox in the rear of the car, I installed the rear motor driver. Since I no longer have windshield wipers, I was able to install the front motor driver onto the block-off plate Because I removed my broken Bose AcoustiWave system, my center speaker was no longer necessary. Using some fish tape, I was able to find a path where I could run the wiring for the GPS unit. With a little bit of double-sided tape, I was able to install the GPS unit, and with the cover back on, it continues to have that OEM look. After finishing my wiring connections, I was able to install the EDFC Active Pro control unit inside of my glove box. Although the glove box is not the most ideal location to put the control unit, it is the best location to maintain that OEM Plus look for my car. As you can see, as I move the door of my glove box, the EDFC Active Pro is already making adjustments. Because the control unit is not sitting at the proper angle and has not been recalibrated, the control unit currently thinks that the car is under acceleration and has firmed up the rear end of the suspension. As I continue to move the door up and down, the control unit continues to think that I'm either accelerating or decelerating, making the adjustments actively. After a long day of hard work, it's time to go to bed, but at least tomorrow we get to try out the EDFC Active Pro system and see exactly what it can do for the RX-7.